14 years ago, she said I lacked the temperament to lead. Today, she walked into my company and asked me for a job.
She used one word: temperament. Like she'd consulted something clinical before choosing it. Like dismissing a man required that level of precision. She said it in front of 8 people on a Tuesday afternoon. And then moved on to the next agenda item. 14 years later, she signed a conflict of interest form acknowledging that the man she'd said it about owned the building she was sitting in. Then she straightened her folder and continued the interview. She knew before she sent the application. She came anyway. My former supervisor, Renata Coles, delivered that assessment on a Tuesday afternoon in a third-floor conference room in downtown Atlanta. Performance review season. The kind of meeting that has a calendar invite and a hidden agenda and fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look slightly guilty. She used the word temperament. Not capability. Not performance. Temperament. Like she'd run a test and received a finding and was now simply delivering it to the room as a matter of record. 8 people at that table. 2 of them I'd helped move into their apartments. One of them looked at the table when she said it. That one I respected more for it, then and now. The light above her head flickered once during the silence after. Just once. Like even the building had reservations. I gathered my folder. I thanked her for her feedback, which is what you say when the thing you actually want to say would only confirm her point. I took the elevator to level 3 of the parking garage. Sat in my car. Gave myself exactly 2 minutes, not because 2 minutes is sufficient, but because it was all I was willing to assign to it. Then I drove home and wrote 4 words on a yellow legal pad. I won't tell you yet what the 4 words were. My name is Deen. I am 44 years old. I run Deen Meridian Consulting out of Atlanta, Georgia. 63 employees. For active contracts with state and municipal agencies. Corner office on the 11th floor of a building where the lease was signed with my hand and my name, and a pen I still keep in my desk drawer, because I am my mother's son. And my mother believed that objects which carry weight deserve to be kept close. I built this from a place that people with comfortable upbringings tend to describe using other people's stories. The kind of place where a good month and a bad month were separated by a number so specific that everyone in the house understood it without it ever being written down or spoken aloud. The kind of place where the heat going out in January was not a crisis. It was a condition. You put on another layer and you kept moving because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not something anyone in my family had ever modeled for me as an option. I grew up in Macon, Georgia. My mother was a home health aide for 22 years. She drove a 1994 Buick LeSabre with a cracked dashboard and a passenger window that only rolled down if you pulled the handle and pushed the glass simultaneously with your palm. She knew every one of her patients by name, by preference, by the particular way each of them needed to be spoken to on a hard day versus an ordinary one. She did not call this exceptional. She called it showing up correctly. She said there was no version of care that didn't require knowing who you were caring for. She kept a small notepad in her scrubs pocket every single day of her working life. Not her phone. A notepad. She wrote down the names of every person she was responsible for before she left the house each morning. Because she said a name you are carrying deserves to be written somewhere, it cannot be lost. When she died, the notepad from her last week of work was still in her pocket. 41 names. Her handwriting. Ink pressed slightly deeper where she had written carefully, where she had meant it. I have it in the center drawer of my desk. I don't display it. It is not a trophy. It is a compass. I take it out when I need to remember what it looks like to treat responsibility as something sacred rather than something administered. I moved to Atlanta at 31 with a project management certification, a consulting framework I had been building quietly for 3 years inside the margins of other people's organizations, and a complete and total refusal to allow Renata Coles to be the final word on what I was capable of producing in this life. I didn't spend much time thinking about her after that parking garage. I thought about the legal pad. I thought about the notepad. I thought about what I was going to build and what it was going to require of me to build it the right way, not just the fast way. That was 13 years ago. 8 days ago, my operations director, Vanessa Osei, walked into my office at 4:17 in the afternoon and placed a resume on my desk face down. She set it down the way you set something down when you already know it contains a decision that belongs to someone else. She didn't say anything immediately. She stood with the particular stillness she uses when she is waiting to find out which version of me is going to show up. I have seen that stillness before. It looks like patience. It is not patience. It is measurement. It is Vanessa taking inventory of a situation before she decides how much of herself to put into it. I turned the resume over. I read the name the way you read something when your eyes have already understood it, and your brain is requesting a second opinion before it commits. Renata Coles. The same name. 14 years of distance between that conference room and this desk. An application for the Senior Operations Associate position at a company she did not know I owned until she searched the directory and found my name on it, and apparently sat with that information for 2 full days before she signed the conflict of interest form, and submitted her materials, and decided to come anyway. I set the resume flat on the desk. I didn't move anything else. I felt something shift inside me, but it was not what you might expect from a man who has just seen the name of the person who publicly reduced him appear on a piece of paper asking for his consideration. It was not heat. It was not the particular brightness of an imagined conversation suddenly made available. It was closer to the feeling that comes right before a contract's signature, when everything is still open, when the pen is in your hand, when you understand that in about 30 seconds the world will be arranged differently than it was, and there is no version of this moment that does not require you to proceed with complete care. Vanessa said the application had arrived through standard channels. The resume was clean. The first screening had passed without flags. Then she placed a second document on top of the first. She tapped it once with 2 fingers, the way she taps things when she needs me to understand something without having to construct the words around it. She said, "Read that one after I leave." She pulled the door to exactly the angle she uses when a conversation is finished and a decision is beginning. I want to tell you about a Monday in March, 7 years into working at Renata's firm. I came in early. I had been building a client proposal for 3 weeks, the kind of work that keeps you up not because you are anxious about it, but because you want to get it exactly right and you know the difference between those 2 things. I set the finished proposal on her desk before anyone else arrived. I remember looking at it sitting there on her clean desk in the early light coming through her office window, and feeling something close to satisfaction, which is a feeling I have learned to be careful about, because it tends to arrive just before the thing that undoes it. By 10 o'clock she was presenting it in a senior leadership meeting. The slides had been reformatted. My name was not on them. I heard about it sideways, the way people relay information they're not certain you already have. Someone mentioned it in passing, watching my face while pretending not to. I processed what they said without showing them I was processing it. Then I went to Renata's office that afternoon, and closed the door quietly and told her, in the most level voice I owned at 30 years old, what I had observed and what I wanted to understand about it. She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the face of someone who has been interrupted during something that actually matters. She said the work product belonged to the team. She said I needed to develop a better understanding of how visibility functioned at this level of the organization. She said it in the tone of someone performing patience for the benefit of someone who doesn't deserve it. I thanked her. I left her office. I drove to my mother's house after work and sat at her kitchen table while she made dinner. And I told her everything that had happened, and she listened the way she always listened, without filling the space, without redirecting, without making it about what I should have done differently. She just let me finish. When I was done, she set down what she was holding and she looked at me and she said, "Baby, some people will take the work and leave you the lesson. Don't waste the lesson." Then she turned back to the stove. I stayed for dinner. I drove home. I gave Renata's firm 4 more months because I needed to see the full shape of the place before I made a move that couldn't be reversed. My mother taught me that a decision made in the middle of a bad day is still a decision. Make it on a clear day when you can see all the way to the edges of what you're choosing. I gave my notice on a clear day in July. I wrote it the same way I write everything that matters. Carefully. Completely. Without leaving anything in it that I didn't mean. In the present, after Vanessa left, I made 1 phone call. I called my attorney. I explained the situation plainly. A former supervisor, one with whom I had a documented professional history, had applied for a role at my company. I needed to understand my obligations clearly before the process moved another step in any direction. He told me what I needed to know. I documented the conversation with the date and the time and the substance of it. Then I called Vanessa and told her to proceed exactly as she would with any candidate, to log everything from the first contact forward, and to build the file as though someone was eventually going to read it looking for a place where the process broke down. Vanessa said, "It's already built that way." She hung up. Vanessa Osei is not someone who performs competence. She either has it or she does not appear. I found her 3 years ago through a colleague who described her in a single sentence. He said she once built a compliance infrastructure for a regional firm using color-coded binders and a shared spreadsheet, because the software budget had not been approved until the second quarter, and the work needed to exist in the first. She used what was available. She finished before the software arrived. That is a specific category of intelligence that I have a great deal of respect for, because it requires not waiting for the right conditions before you begin. When I interviewed her, before we discussed the role or the compensation or the scope of what I was building, she asked me one question. She asked me what I did when I made a wrong decision. I told her the truth. I told her I documented it. I sat with it long enough to understand exactly where the thinking had broken down. Not just that it had broken down, but the specific place and the specific assumption that had failed, because a mistake you don't fully understand is simply a mistake that is waiting to find you again in a different shape when you are less prepared for it. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone thinking. The quiet of someone who has already reached a conclusion and is deciding whether to share it. She said, "Most people give me the answer they think I want." That was the actual answer. She started 2 weeks later. In the present, before she had left my office, she stopped at the door without turning fully around and said that the file had been logged from the day the application arrived. Every contact, every date, every decision point documented in sequence. She said if anyone ever opened that file looking for something that wasn't done correctly, they would not find it. Then she left at exactly that angle. The morning of Renata's interview, I came in at 6:30, which is normal for me. Made coffee in the break room. Stood at the window for a while, and watched the city below arrange itself into a working day. James Whitmore, my senior analyst, was already at his desk the way he always is, without ceremony, without needing anyone to notice, focused on the numbers in front of him with the kind of quiet consistency that makes every room around him more serious. We talked briefly about a municipal proposal deadline. He has a way of discussing work that makes the work feel like the only thing that matters, which in those moments it is. At some point he glanced toward the shelf near my window and said, "Is that the Macon City Hall renovation? My uncle was on that crew." I told him yes. He looked at it for a moment the way people look at something when it carries more meaning than they are going to put into words. Then he went back to his numbers without making anything of it. I went to my desk. I opened the center drawer and took out my mother's notepad. I did not open it. I held it in both hands, felt the weight of it, the particular texture of the cover where her hands had held it before mine. 41 names inside in her handwriting. Ink pressed slightly deeper in the places where she had been most deliberate. I held it for about 30 seconds. Then I closed the drawer and started the day. Across town, I learned later, Renata was standing in a hotel bathroom putting herself together and rehearsing language. She had researched the company thoroughly before applying. She had found the contract announcements, the press mentions, the profile piece from 2 years prior. She had found my name on the building directory. She had read my biography on the company website, which I had written plainly and without embellishment because I do not believe in performing a version of yourself for an audience. She knew exactly who she was applying to work for. What she was deciding, apparently, in that hotel bathroom, was whether the knowing changed anything. Whether she could carry herself through the door of a building owned by a man she had publicly reduced, and ask for something he now had the standing to provide or withhold. Whether she had enough left of whatever she'd once had to do that. She decided she did. I want you to hold that for a moment. Not with contempt. With something more complicated than contempt. Because a person who has been reduced by circumstances to that particular doorway, who knows whose name is above it and walks through anyway, is not performing arrogance. They are performing survival. And survival at that level deserves at minimum to be seen clearly before it is judged. Vanessa ran the interview with Marcus Webb, my senior project lead, and conducted it with the precision and structural consistency she brings to everything she touches. Documented. Timed. No variance from standard process. I received no update during the 40 minutes it ran because I had requested none, and Vanessa had correctly provided none. What I did do was walk through the atrium at a moment I had considered, carrying a folder I did not need, moving in the direction of the copy room which required passing through the open waiting area. Renata was in the interview room. Her husband was not. He had driven her, and was sitting near the window in the waiting area with a coffee he had carried in from somewhere outside the building. The outside coffee told me something about how long he had expected to wait, and how much he had wanted something specific to do with his hands during the waiting. He stood when he recognized me. Not the standing of a man who is pleased to see someone. The standing of a man whose body has registered a change in the room before his mind has finished processing what the change means. He said my name. Not as a greeting. As a question. As in, is it actually you? And if it is, what is the correct thing for me to do with that information right now? I said hello. I asked whether he was comfortable. He said yes, and then he said Renata had always spoken well of the company, which I understood to be the carefully edited version of something considerably more complicated that he had decided, wisely, not to say in this particular lobby on this particular morning. I thanked him for coming in. I continued to the copy room. I stood there for approximately 40 seconds doing nothing that required the copy room. Then I walked back. He was looking at his phone when I passed. His shoulders were doing something they likely didn't know they were doing. The particular thing shoulders do when a person is maintaining a posture they no longer have full confidence in, but have not yet found a way to release without it showing. I went back to my desk. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be precise about that because it matters to what this story actually is. I felt the particular weight of a situation that has been in motion for a very long time, and has finally arrived at the moment it was always moving toward. That is not triumph. That is something older and more sober than triumph. It is the feeling of a long equation finally reaching its last line. At the 20-minute mark, Vanessa knocked once on my office door. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and stood in the way she stands when she is delivering information that has been carefully handled, and is now being transferred with equal care. She told me that at the opening of the interview, Renata had asked whether the owner of the company was involved in the hiring process for this specific role. Vanessa had answered accurately. She told Renata that the owner had identified a potential conflict of interest on the day the application was received, had formally recused himself from all evaluation and selection decisions per company policy, and that the process was being conducted entirely by HR and relevant department leadership with full documentation at every stage. Renata had nodded. She had continued the interview. Vanessa then set the conflict of interest disclosure form on my desk and positioned it so I could read the signature line without picking it up. Renata had received the form 3 days after her application was processed. She had signed it and returned it 48 hours later. 2 full days between receiving the form and signing it. I thought about what those 2 days contained. What she read and reread in that hotel room. What she said to her husband and what he said back. What she decided about herself and about this moment. And about what she still needed to believe was possible. And then she signed her name and came anyway. I sat with that for a long time without moving. Something settled in me that I had not realized was still standing. Not triumph. I want to be clear about that again because it bears repeating. Not satisfaction in the way people mean when they imagine this kind of moment. Something older and quieter than both of those. The particular stillness of a truth that has been waiting in a room for a very long time, and has finally been given permission to sit down. The decision came from Vanessa's team 3 days after the interview. Another candidate. Someone her team had identified in the first week of the search, before Renata's application had arrived through the standard portal, before any of this had become what it became. That candidate had been the recommendation from the beginning of the process. Everything else had simply moved correctly around that fact without disturbing it. Vanessa sent the standard written notification. The same letter that goes to every candidate who is not selected. Language chosen for accuracy and professionalism, and nothing beyond that. Selection of an individual whose background most closely aligned with the specific requirements of the role at this time. Clean. Documented. Closed. I found out from Marcus Webb, 3 days after the decision was sent, that Renata had sat in her car in our parking garage for several minutes after leaving the building on the day of her interview. He had seen her from his window on the 6th floor, and had said nothing to anyone until the process was fully concluded, because Marcus understands precisely how things should be held and when. She had not started the car immediately. She had just sat there. I understood that completely. I had done the same thing in a different parking garage on a different Tuesday 14 years earlier. I knew what kind of arithmetic happens in that particular stillness. The kind where you add up what you thought was true against what has just been confirmed as true and wait for the two numbers to reconcile into something you can drive away from. Eventually she started the car. She drove away slowly. The way you drive when you are not yet certain where you are going, or when you know exactly where you are going, and you are simply not ready to arrive there yet. That evening I stayed late, which is ordinary for me. The building finds a particular quality of quiet after 6 that I have always found useful for real thinking, the kind of thinking that requires room around it. I went to the break room and poured something I wasn't going to finish, and sat in one of the plastic chairs near the window. Loretta James, my office manager, came in for her bag. She saw me and nearly kept moving. Then she stopped. She stood at the counter for a moment looking at the window the way people look at windows when they are deciding whether to say a thing or leave it where it is. She said her daughter had asked her that week what she did for work. She told her she worked for a company built by a man from Macon who took something that should have broken him and turned it into 63 people's livelihoods. Her daughter had asked whether he knew he was going to do that when he started. Loretta picked up her bag and looked at me directly and said, I told her I didn't think anyone knows that at the beginning. I think they just decide what kind of person they're going to be, and then they keep being it until the answer shows up. She said good night. I sat with that for a long time. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in recent memory, and she didn't know she was saying it to the right person at exactly the right moment, which is almost always how the right things get said. The next morning I came in at 6:30, made coffee, sat at my desk in the early quiet, opened the center drawer, and took out my mother's notepad. This time I opened it. I read all 41 names in order slowly, the way she would have said them to herself before she left the house each morning. I had never done that before. I had always held the notepad closed, felt the cover, looked at her handwriting on the outside, and put it back. But that morning I opened it, and I read every name, and I sat with each one for a moment before moving to the next. And what I understood, reading them in that order in that early light, that I had not found the precise language for before, was this. She wasn't keeping a record. She wasn't cataloging her own worth or building evidence of her dedication. She was making sure that each person she was responsible for remained fully real to her, before she walked through their door. She was writing their names so that she would already be someone who had taken them seriously before she arrived, so that her care would be in place before she needed to perform it, so that it would not be performance at all. That was the whole practice. That was everything she was trying to teach me every time I watched her do it, and thought I understood it, and didn't yet fully understand it. I closed the notepad carefully. I placed it back in the center drawer. I picked up the pen I had used to sign the lease on this office and held it for a moment, felt the weight of it, set it down. Then I opened my laptop and began the day. Renata Coles stood at the head of a conference room when I was 30 years old, and told 8 people I lacked the temperament to lead. And I want to be honest with you about something because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth the time it takes to tell. She was not entirely wrong. Not about where I was going, but about where I was. I was 30 years old and I was still learning, in the places that don't show, what it actually costs to lead something real. What it requires of you when no one is watching and the decision is hard and the easier path is available and visible and nobody would fault you for taking it. I hadn't built anything yet that could answer what she said. The answer was in process. It just wasn't finished. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known from where she was standing, was that the lesson she left me was going to become part of the foundation. My mother wrote 41 names in a notepad every morning because she believed the people you carry deserve to be held with intention before you arrive at their door. I built a company because I believed work done honestly is its own argument that requires no additional defense. Renata walked into a building I own and received the same fair and documented process I give everyone, not because she deserved special consideration, and not to make a point, but because that standard was never constructed around her. It was constructed around the 4 words I wrote on a legal pad on a Tuesday night in a parking garage 14 years ago, when I had nothing built yet, and everything still to prove. Watch what I build. Not for her. Not for the lobby moment or the conflict of interest form, or the parking garage where she sat afterward doing the arithmetic. Not for the story. Because that is who I decided to be before anyone was watching. And you keep being that person when the answer shows up. And then, because it is not about the answer, you keep being it anyway. If this story found you at the right moment, subscribe before you go. There are more of these coming, and I want you there when they do.